right now, you should go to patreon.com/unregistered and become a patron of this show. When you do that, you will have access to roughly half of the episodes of Unregistered. You can also see the weekly unreported news analysis show with me, regular AMAs, and you'll have access to Thursday night's Unregistered Live Zoom meetings with me. But at the Unregistered Academy level, you can take all of our courses. We already have 5 on the books that you can watch right now, and we have multiple live interactive webinars coming up throughout the summer. So again, go to patreon.com/unregistered and become a patron right now. I'll see you in class. This is the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. This is a show about ideas, people, and behaviors that are considered inappropriate, out of bounds, or beyond the pale. The things you're not supposed to talk about if you're a school teacher, a college professor, a businessman, a politician, a parent, a neighbor, or even a podcast host. These are the things you're not supposed to say or even think if you're a good liberal, a good conservative, or a good citizen. Each week, I'll interview a person who has something bad to say. They might be a journalist or a professor. They might be a porn star or a drug dealer. They might just be an ordinary person with an ordinary job who doesn't care about the rules of polite society. I'm not interested in breaking the rules just to be a troublemaker. I'm interested in people who break the rules of conventional thought and to expand the scope of what is possible to say in our society. I'm interested in people who make me think. There's a new political and intellectual force in this country that we call the alt-right, or the dissident right, or the new right. Everybody's talking about it, yet very few people seem to understand what it is. And that's why I had this week's guest on the show. The alt-right, or the dissident right, or the new right, is very likely to gain political power in this country very shortly, perhaps more so than under Donald Trump. And so I wanted to know what's coming. This is my interview with Gio Pennacchietti. I've just been informed that I am joined from the first post-national country in a small town near Niagara Falls, Ontario, by Gio Pennacchietti, who is one of my very favorite people online these days, who I've been learning so much from, who just taught a course with us on the religious right, which was amazing. And that's one of the reasons it went so well. One of the reasons I invited him on this show, because this guy's got a lot to say that people need to hear and stuff that is very fascinating. We are also here today with Michael Wimer, who will be interviewing with Gio with me. Many people in the unregistered world know about Michael. Michael knows a lot about the subject we're going to be dealing with today. And so I'm really looking forward to this. A new format and a guest I'm very excited to have on. Gio, thanks for coming on the show.
Oh, the pleasure's mine. This is a great opportunity. I am Thaddeus Russell, strongest soldier right now. So there you go.
Careful with that one. Be careful with that one.
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah. Yeah.
All right. So let's talk about who the hell you are. You're right wing. You're an artist. You're a former graduate student academic, philosophy, political science. You've studied that. You are a huge Twitter guy, huge online guy. You write blogs, you write reviews of all sorts of things. You are an art expert. You write about art. You do art. What else do you do? Who are you?
Podcaster, failed academic. No, you're pumping me up so much. I feel bad. Actually, people are going to be sorely disappointed. I'm just some fat guy in Ontario, literally in my basement. Yeah. Oh boy.
No neck beard, yes, though. You shaved your neck. That's good.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. I like the goatee look. My sense of personal style comes from a few things, mostly early 2000s new metal. I'm going for the corn / Chino Marino look. So
Nice.
no, but yes, I am all those things: a podcaster, writer, artist, printmaker. But yeah, I've been doing this for a long time. I've been in the trenches of, I guess you would call, frog Twitter. And yeah, I've recently struck out on my own. I was a part of another podcast, but now I'm on my own. I do every weekly things, but my main flagship is called Content Minded. Go to YouTube on my channel, Genre Productions, my Patreon, patreon.com/Genre Productions, shameless shilling. But no, yeah, I'm just, I think I occupy a bit of a niche in the sense that I write about art. I am an artist, but also a huge part of my university education deals with continental and critical theory. Started off in Eastern philosophy, but then slowly moved towards more critical theory. When I did my MA in political science, it was mostly around the middle works of Michel Foucault, which is very shocking for people in the political right now. We'll get into that. But my supervisor was a hardcore postmodernist, and he was a Foucault scholar in his own right. And he really drilled into me a lot of like assumptions I had to, very painful alchemical process, being someone who I guess went through all the stages of being a person on the, what would you call it? The new right, the dissident right. I was like, when I was younger, I was a ANCAP New Ager, then went back to conservatism, then eventually got into like the sort of NRX blog sphere. Although I never really identified that much with NRX. I think now I'm basically the full spectrum of quote unquote dissident right. I mean, we can haggle over those terms as we did in our seminar. But
let's talk about those terms. So just so people have a roadmap here, and I do too. I mean, I'm not 100% sure what they mean either. So NRX, what does that mean? What is it?
Neo-reaction. Thinkers like, but they encompass different things. But when people think of neo-reaction, they think of Curtis Yarvin, mentioned Smoldbug, his blog on qualified reservations. But it was encompassed many different sort of subsects of the way you deal with questions of governance, the way you deal with questions of even the human subject. Yarvin provides the sort of classic, what you would colloquially term reactionary, using very like older thinkers to instantiate a critique of modern liberalism, but also sort of retaining certain elements such as managerialism and so forth. Then you have like accelerationism that comes out of the CCRU. You have Nick Land. Of course, he breaks away from accelerationism, which is coded towards more left-wing ideology. But Nick Land certainly embodies the more like out there tech utopia, well, dystopian, depending on who you talk to, side of NRX. And then you also have religious trads. You have people exploring more sort of ideas like monarchy and so forth. And then also you have very science-orientated, quote unquote, I don't know about the YouTube algorithm here, but like human biodiversity, a lot of manosphere stuff, hypergamy, a lot of like the one blogger, our anonymous conservative, had the R versus K selection theory, stuff like that. And then of course you have the alt-right, which comes out of NRX, but then of course they break away. NRX is more of an intellectual thing. The alt-right is more eventually became sort of white identitarian politics. But these things have gone by the wayside. These things are no more. I mean, the ideas hang in the sort of ether, but the movements themselves are gone. I mean, NRX, you could say that NRX has achieved somewhat of an ascendancy because Curtis Yarvin has become such a popular figure. Same with Nick Land, of course. Nick Land was sort of unpersoned from academia for obvious reasons. But these things, same with, I guess you could say, the ideas that come out of a much older version of the alt-right that is born from paleoconservatism. People like Jared Taylor, they come from like people like Pat Buchanan. Jared Taylor, Derbyshire, who was infamously kicked off of National Review, And then you also have people that do focus very heavily on more science-orientated things like Spandrel and Steve Saylor. Then you also have religious trads who are much more in line with orthodoxy and traditional Catholicism and so forth. So you have basically NRX as the beginning of what now people term the dissident right. But of course, those trains of thinking are much older, in America at least, with paleoconservatism. The paleocons, for people who don't know this, the paleocons were basically dethroned from what they call quote unquote fusionism. Fusionism was, in the 1980s, was the attempt by the National Review under William F. Buckley to take people that didn't agree with each other and form the modern conservatism wing, mostly of the Republican Party. You have Straussians in academia, you have neoconservatives, you have the lobby of a particular nation in the Middle East, which I shall not name because of YouTube. And you also have people who are very like William F. Buckley, who are very coastal, almost blue almost like, red Democrats or whatever they call it in America. But of course, what happened was the paleoconservatives who are more nativist, who sort of entertained this sort of seedlings of white identitarian politics, but of course are not white nationalists. I wouldn't call Pat Buchanan a white nationalist. These people were unpersoned by National Review, and they were kicked out of the coalition. The Republicans went with neocons. They went with very hardcore free market libertarian, free market fundamentalists, essentially. I know that's a term that comes from Paul Krugman, but it is true. They are free market fundamentalists. And the paleocons, who embodied more of a European old world form of conservatism, they were kicked out of the coalition. But then years later, when neoconservatism during the Bush years and then later the Obama years was totally decimated, and the Obama administration achieved a sort of cultural ascendancy for semi-progressive but more neoliberal ideas. This is where you have the sort of inklings in the blogger sphere. Because remember, Curtis Yarvin started writing around like 2008, 2009. Even before that, he was in the Usenet days. You have these seeds of reaction starting to boil up. And by the time you hit 2014, 2015, after the Gamergate thing, now you have the alt-right. Now, then eventually you have the frogs that migrate from various forums, frog Twitter. Then you also have the MAGA movement, which is, I wouldn't equate with the alt-right. Certain figures in the alt-right have claimed that they were responsible for Donald Trump and then later disavowed Donald Trump. But I think Donald Trump was in some ways a reckoning for the trajectory of both liberalism and conservatism. Not that there's much of a huge difference in terms of massive politics in America. And sort of the idea, at least the symbol of Donald Trump, maybe not the actuality of Donald Trump, culminated in this sort of greater critique of the current politics of the day, from the Clinton years, the Bush years, so forth. Some people have also said that even as far back as the 80s and 90s militia movement informed a lot of the ideas that we're seeing now in terms of conspiracy theories, in terms of white nationalism and so forth. It's very, I would say, broad picture of the beginning of 21st century politics in terms of what we mean by the dissident right or the new right, because it encompasses so many different strands that it takes a lot of time to unpack, which unfortunately people that have a job of going after the dissident right, they're terribly uninformed with this. I mean, the journalists themselves are just, they don't do a proper job of looking at the genealogy, because if you really truly wanted to hit hard the dissident right, then you would sort of come up with all sorts of different genealogical points in terms of its origins that I think is a much more effective critique than saying that, racism and Donald Trump retweeted someone who says the Civil War is coming and it's all crap.
Okay, so this is a really good guide. I love that. So the neocons are not a part of this, right? They're the enemy. They're one
very
of the
much
reasons,
so. They're even more the enemy than the progressives in some
right. And in fact, they're very much the reason for the emergence of the new right, aren't they?
I would say in part, yes.
Okay, so then you say there are all these different strands, and you did a beautiful job of describing them within the new right, what we're calling the new right or the dissident right. So tell us now, what brings all those strands together? What do they have in common?
It's very hard to say, because it's funny
Yeah.
you mentioned this, because this is a current jumping off point in terms of like what motivates the dissident right. Now, a lot of people would say that the dissident right is a phenomenon via negativa. It is something that is, we are united by a common enemy, whatever that enemy is. And I would say that perhaps a critique of liberalism as a whole in terms of a civilizational system could potentially be there. But of course, this is complicated by certain voices within the dissident right who say that either modern liberalism does not exist as we know it, or it's a spook, or that it's something that like is a fiction. And what we have now is in fact not liberalism. But this is, of course, I think a more of a niche critique. Because the thing that really complicates it is that you have what people have referred to back in the day as the alternative light. Now we call them the intellectual dark web. We call them the woke centrists, whatever. People like very much Quillette Institute, Quillette Magazine, people like Jordan Peterson, people who have immense audiences and immense voices, people that you wouldn't consider right-wing but are coded right-wing in the current culture because of their willingness to question certain things. We view them as gatekeepers, more or less, as people that are ineffective in terms of rhetoric, people that may... The question is, okay, what unites all of us, right? I think it is kind of a negative thing. It is a critique. But in terms of the way that the political left is certainly a certain faction of the political left has framed what they call the quote unquote radicalization pipeline is kind of a misnomer. Because if the thesis is that if you watch a Jordan Peterson video, eventually you'll go to, I don't know, what's the middle point? Eventually you'll watch Joe Rogan. Then from Joe Rogan, you'll go to Thaddeus Russell. From Thaddeus Russell, you will go to Keith Woods. And then from Keith Woods, you will go to some racist forum on Telegram. I think that in some ways it kind of is true, but it was true for a time, but it's not true in the way people think. It's true in the sense that certain people have certain proclivities of thinking and that they were always going to end up there eventually. But when it comes to the message of people like the Weinsteins or Jordan Peterson or who else am I thinking of here? The meaning crisis people, John Vervaeke. These people are not right-wing. They are not, they don't have any intention of guiding their audience towards a right-wing position at all whatsoever.
Right.
But it's interesting how, when it comes to the way that the media codes things, Jordan Peterson gets spoken of in the same breath as let's say who is more of a right wing. Oh, Tucker Carlson. Tucker Carlson's the biggest demon to the left right now. So I think it's very interesting what unites Tucker Carlson, what unites let's say a YouTuber like Orrin McIntyre, who's a good friend of mine. What unites someone like Bronze Age Pervert? What unites all of us? It is a substantial critique of the politics of the day, but also the mechanisms by which the liberal regime has instantiated itself for the past 50 to 100 years as the only order of things from the 20th century onwards. Why is it that it's so seemingly impossible to think of an alternative outside of this sort of the global liberal picture? Why is it such an impossibility? And then you also have people who certainly my circles are hostile to, but in terms of their critique of the liberal order, you have academics like Patrick Janine, like Adrian Vermeule, like Sorban Amari. Yeah.
Sorab, yeah.
Yeah. So you have the post-liberals in academia. But that's on one level. Then you have Bronze Age Pervert, who is doing something very different. People like Bronze Age Pervert, people like who are very popular on the dissident right, either semi-anonymous or anonymously. So you have different people doing different things, but we're all sort of, I wouldn't call it a movement though. This is what we were discussing. I would more call it an avant-garde for different reasons, but I wouldn't, it is a very good question. It's a question that I'm wrestling with myself as to what unites what we broadly term the dissident right or the new right. Some people think the dissident right is a fiction, by the way. Some people think that it's just a conglomeration of cults of personality. My good friend Josh Neal, who is a writer. He wrote the book American Extremists. He says this flat out: there's no such thing as dissident right, or rather that we create a sort of fictional camaraderie among ourselves, and that in reality it's made up of a bunch of diffuse and disparate nodes that have their own little sort of politics and their own little micro cults of personality, and that sometimes these nodes clash with each other. Actually, oftentimes these nodes clash with each other, and it's very difficult to parse out what constitutes a quote unquote political movement. That is incredibly difficult. And I am kind of this opinion, but I do say that there is a loose connecting tissue among us, in that we all have the desire to, I don't want to Fedpost. I don't want to say topple the regime. I mean that we have a desire of picturing a way of life that is outside of the current order of things. I wouldn't go as far as to Fedpost and say that even using the term Fedpost is again another niche in inner circle thing, but you know what I mean by Fedpost. I wouldn't want to say that we have this illusion of toppling the regime. Like there are people that say that Donald Trump or whoever, there is a conscious effort during that one incident that happened that where a year ago or two, that there was some conscious plan and that this was insurrection, or can I even say insurrection YouTube? Like all these things are a total misnomer, because
by the way, this is not going on YouTube.
Oh,
so you can say, this is a non-YouTube one. Yeah. So you can say whatever you want.
Okay.
Keep going. Yeah.
Yeah. January 6th.
The attempted insurrection.
I think that it's very difficult because along with the discourse of the dissident right, you have it's funny because we're talking about Foucault, a very powerful hermeneutics of suspicion, in the sense that there is always like the sort of specter of, is there quote unquote glow in the darks? Is there feds among us? Are there people that are infiltrating our movements? Are there people that are agitating towards certain directions? And immediately you have this sort of the hermeneutics of suspicion, which is that there's always federal agents among us. They're always monitoring us. They're always guiding certain people who have certain neurological disorders and certain lack of authority figures in their lives. They're guiding them towards certain things. So
right.
There's always that. So this complicates any real world organizing when it comes to the quote unquote dissident right. This complicates things because after Charlottesville, certainly after January 6th, there is a pervasive feeling that in real life organization, maybe not in Europe, but ironically enough, in America, is near impossible. There are people that I know who do private meetups, who are very discreet, who are very have superior OPSEC, but in terms of mass movement organizing, that is sort of still the alchemical stone in terms of forming a lasting political movement out of an avant-garde, out of this sort of sharing of knowledge. Because it's been on the huge major attempts, it's been disastrous both times.
Right.
So, yeah.
So the right wing, when I was growing up and well into my adulthood, was the Republican Party. It was Ronald Reagan. It was the National Review. It was William F. Buckley. It was Firing Line. It was George Will. That was about it. They never talked about modernity. They never had a critique or care, seemingly, of the modern. That to me is what sets you all apart, the new right, the dissident right. And that's to me what binds you all together more than your hatred of liberalism, I think, is your bigger, broader, much more consequential critique of modernity, the modern age, the ideologies and cultures that have been produced and maintained and spread across the globe over the last several hundred years. Am I right about that? That's what brings you all together, and that's what makes you different than from the right wing that I grew up with?
Very much so. Very much
so.
I would say that it depends on the critique, though, because there is a faction, I think, that there is, and I would notice the trend of the last, I would say, let's call it the Covidian era, last 2 years. Whether we're in a post-Covidian era, there has been a lot of talk among the dissident right of not splitting up entirely, but rather there's growing sentiments between, let's call them the romanticist side of it, which is people who are traditionalists, people who are anti-liberals, people who are broadly tech skeptical as well, people that read Linkola and Ted Kaczynski. Then there's people who are more on let's call them the futurist side of things. There are people who are entertain certain ideas about the health of a population, certain ideas of a technocratic order that fit sort of a more explicitly rightist narrative. People that look towards things like the Italian futurists, people that are certainly not as critical of, let's call them techno-modernity. Let's call it techno-modernity than people who are more of the religious bent. And the thing is that there are people who are fit the middle of this. I mean, there are people on that side on the very far end who are explicit eugenicists, not in the sense of like the Austrian painter, but certainly in the sense of looking at things in terms of the health of the organism as a whole, looking at things of how that's why you get like more right-wing people nowadays are into like weirdo esoteric health things.
Yeah.
Because which hippies used to be a part
Yeah.
of. But the reason is because if you're looking at the sort of the biome of a civilization and you're looking at, and here's the thing, I'm somewhat sympathetic to some of their ideas. I think that, well, certainly the health thing. I mean, ironically, well, anyways.
Well, can I say real quick, I've noticed
go ahead, Michael.
making a rightward shift in the last couple of weeks. I've noticed a lot of hippies who want to be left alone, smoke their pot, make their own health decisions, becoming MAGA hippies.
There's MAGA hippies who are more of the normie spectrum. They come out of libertarianism. They come out of the Ron Paul people. But then there are people who like talk about how is it that we can't live in sort of the same space when people are so radically different from each other. There's people like, for example, the thinker Spandrel talks about the concept of bio-Leninism, how a lot of progressive ideology and a lot of the state ordaining progressive ideology and a lot of these people seeking positions of power, that is a biological phenomenon. That is, they're hardwired to have this is the idea of bio-Leninism. There's problems with it as well. That these people are hardwired to ensure loyalty to the system because they wouldn't have gotten positions otherwise. Certainly in America. There's other aspects of bio-Leninism. There's amazing blog posts that he does. But Spandrel, before you got banned on Twitter, you blocked me because I had a post that was critical of China. He's a big China guy. So no, I'm kidding. But Spandrel's work is a very good highlight in this area. Then you have people who are what used to be known as Pine Tree Twitter, people that are very explicitly anti-technology and anti-modernity, people who are more of, I would call the romanticist bent, who are very skeptical of techno-modernity. And these two, there's people in the middle, by the way. I would say Bronze Age pervert is the middle. I would say Curtis Yarvin leans towards that side, but of course he himself is not fascistic or, well, by definition, he cannot be like Nazi-esque because he's of his certain ethnic character. He actually did, with a friend of mine, he did 4 hours with, he works for the right stuff. His name is Borzi. He has this podcast called Hyper Podcastism. He did 4 hours with Curtis Yarvin on Nazi Germany. So very, very interesting listen. So, but of course, Yarvin's ideas in terms of looking at technocratic solutions to certain problems of modernity, he's certainly more along those lines, but he's not the total end. Like, I think he doesn't really talk about like biology and human diversity that much compared to Steve Saylor or people who write for UNZ Review, those type of people. But then the other end is, it's funny because the other end, they do have certain ideas of that ilk as well, but they are much more critical of modernity. Those are like the trads. Those are the return people. And they also have substantial differences because there's people who adopt sort of a neo-paganism when it comes to environmental issues. There are religious Christians who are much more in line with would not doubt that, what's his name, Dreyer, called the Benedict option, where it's like you live in your traditionalist religious community, you marry at a young age, you have a lot of kids. There are various sort of there's a lot of problems with these two subsections, but yet there are people in the middle who sort of have to reconcile those things.
Mhm.
Now, Bronze Age pervert, for example, he's very critical of the religious trads in the sense that he sees that a moral revanchism, as he said recently on his podcast, a moral reawakening sort of never translates into actual political action. I think he's kind of wrong about that, but he's been critical as of late of the sort of romanticist approach that just become a trad dad, pop out a lot of kids, live in a religious community. He rightly, correctly points out that there's problems with that approach. But the religious trads, a lot of them don't like him because they think that he is basically justifying promiscuity. So, and of course, some people rumor because of his posting and his love of the male aesthetic body that he's gay or whatever. Like, there's always those rumors. Like, it seems everyone in the dissident right is accused of being gay eventually, right? So no, but yeah. So, but I think Bronze Age Pervert offers a very substantial critique of the romanticist side. But there are people that critique the sort of, let's call it, futurist bent to the dissident right.
Right. Okay.
And Moldbug's ideas as well. I have my own critiques of Moldbug's ideas.
So one quick note on futurism. Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I see futurism as kind of the foundation of Italian fascism of the 20s.
Yes, sir.
Is that a connecting thread to this new movement? Are they resurrecting that? Or
Thank you. Yeah.
I think yes, there are people who are more aesthetically inclined, like Bronze Age Pervert. But I would say that a big driving force, which, by the way, is in both camps. I mean, there's other factions as well, but a driving force is the recognition of racial difference and sexual difference, and essentialism. Essentialism undergirds pretty much this whole spectrum of right-wing thinking.
Yeah.
Even the neocons have a form of essentialism.
But not you, right? You're a postmodernist right-winger. Are you not?
I because of my religious convictions, I believe that there is a foundational essentialism, but when it comes to the culture and the politics and the sort of the episteme, as Foucault would call, of the day, I think that we live in the postmodern condition and that we have to recognize that as a force, and that to have an illusion of breaking free of it, I think, is a misnomer. I think people have tried, both in the left and the right. Certainly the political left has almost 100% abandoned, not 100%, but they have to prop up certain forms of continental thinking and anti-essentialism to prop up certain political ideas. But I think that as a whole, the mainstream political left, they're sort of, the power structure in current liberal modernity has compelled them to sort of selectively abandon certain postmodern ideals. Very much so, we live in an age of new sincerity, quote unquote. And this entails that, for example, the meta-modern thing.
Go ahead,
Michael.
Can you make the distinctions between new sincerity, post-irony, meta-modernism?
This is a very difficult task, actually.
Please, sorry.
So new sincerity is kind of like, like your David Foster Wallace. Not to say that David Foster Wallace is like a progressive or whatever. But this comes out of literature. This comes out of, and I know people that know more about this. I'm going to butcher it, but so I'm being honest about this. But let's say that new sincerity comes out of this impulse to grapple with postmodernity, to grapple with cynicism and irony, and to say that, yes, it is true that we can experience sort of sincere and honest and heartfelt moments free of irony. But the thing is, with metamodernism is difficult to define, but it's the swaying between like postmodernity and this new sincerity thing. But a lot of right-wing people, I think around, I would say 2015, 2016, tried to appropriate metamodernism. But the problem is that a lot of the foundational thinkers themselves, they are very much liberal. They are people, I mean, some people associated with them have explicitly gone after the right wing, have gone after artists who were like friendlier with the right wing. This one, I don't even know if I should mention him. This Luke Turner guy who is like this trust fund Tommy academic kid, failed artist. He was the one that was bankrolling Shia LaBeouf to do the He Will Not Divide Us thing as a meta-modern performance piece. He went after some friends of mine. He went after people on the political right. He's associated with people that go after Curtis Yarvin, that think that Curtis Yarvin's a Nazi or whatever. So you have a lot of also philosophers that are very critical of the new right. But basically, in my assessment, my critique of metamodernism is that I believe that metamodernism is a way for liberals to say, okay, we have to be sincere now. We have to like have, sincere convictions that would be in the 1990s and early 2000s would be seen as like, it would be hand waved away, at least in my assessment. So, yeah.
The ultimate piece of metamodern art that I use as the example is Parks and Rec.
Yes.
Yeah,
or The Office.
Show.
Or The Office. Yeah.
Yeah, or The Office. Yeah. But it's kind of patronizing, right? It's like
explain that. How are these shows examples of that?
Normally it would be like a comedy where people are just silly and dumb and there's no progression. But like with Parks and Rec, it's a nice young Indiana podunk town, and you start to feel affection for these hicks, and you root for Leslie Knope, the noble Hillary Clinton-esque government worker, to help solve their problems, and you fall in love with them for their quirkiness for real, and that's part of the charm of it.
Yeah, it's hence the new sincerity aspect of it.
Okay,
it's very much like what we call Reddit wholesome chungus, but I would think that the political right, at least in some ways of thinking, is also susceptible to this. There are people that say that certain forms of traditionalism is itself like a recapitulation of new sincerity, is a form of like quote unquote wholesome chungus, type of thinking.
Or for example, Sam Hyde, when he did Hyde Wars, and he started giving actual good advice to his listeners. Is that new sincerity? Is that metamodern? Like, what is that?
I wouldn't think so. I think that that's just Sam Hyde. I think in a more reflective mode of his career on the internet and elsewhere, I think that's him sort of offering his life advice. But I mean, you could probably say something about that. Yeah, because you asked about meta irony, right?
Post irony.
Post irony.
Yeah. Post irony.
Yeah, post irony is sort of like you dabble with sincerity, if I recall. Like, again, these definitions are quite confusing, but meta irony is basically what Sam Hyde does. It's the foundation of a lot of right-wing humor, where Michael, help me out here. What's the exact definition? It's like where you say like kind of what I do a little bit too as well in podcasts, where you say something that is shocking and there's an ambiguity as to whether you actually believe it. But you do believe it sincerely, but by pretending otherwise, then you can sort of like subvert the narrative.
Yeah. Like Sam Hyde once said, like he was talking about his car being beat up and tricking it out like a Laotian owned it. And the guy interviewing him asked him, well, what's up with Laos? And he's like, Laos, they're a beautiful country with great aesthetics. So it's like sarcasm, but yeah.
There, he did the skit once. A best example would be he did a skit back in the MDE days when they were just on YouTube before the Adult Swim show. It was called Officer Maggot, Dick Cop F slur. Officer Maggot was like the stereotypical racist cop that would pull racial minorities over. He'd screw with them. He'd do all the racial epithets. But the thing is, though, the ambiguity is that, is it spoofing racist cops in America, or is it spoofing what people think in terms of the media depiction of racist cops in America? And he did this around the what year was this? This was around
Mike Brown.
Mike Brown. Yeah. There you go. So here's meta irony. Okay. So he did this comedy skit. So Sam Hyde used to do stand-up, where he did this skit where in front of this like hipster bar in Boston. It's you know that he's like, you know that who's that, the redneck comedian guy? What's his name?
Foxworthy? Larry the Cable
Jeff
Guy?
Foxworthy. Yeah. Not Larry, Jeff Foxworthy, where he's like, you know, you may be a redneck if he's like, you may be Mike Brown if he's like, if you strong arm a convenience store owner and then the president says that you could be my son, you might be Mike Brown. So he kept rattling this off, and the whole intention of the skit was that the whole crowd would just clear out. Like literally the whole, you can find on YouTube, the archive. It only took like 2 minutes from the beginning of this for the whole crowd to clear out. So the point being is that he may believe that this is like the contrary narrative of Mike Brown. He may, you know, of course he probably believes that the whole like Mike Brown was a saint, he was a gentle giant, that's crap, right? But it's the shock value of getting the libs in the audience, the hipster libs, to clear out. That is the goal. That was part of the performance, not the comedy act itself. So that's hence why people term it meta irony. He also did another one where he went to a New York university and he started rattling off statistics about LGBT issues of certain hate facts, if you will. And again, that was another sort of meta-ironic performance where it wasn't necessarily about spreading hate facts in a sincere manner, but rather it's about making the sort of hipster liberal audience uncomfortable in a, you know, sort of deeper way.
All right. Now, what the liberals on the left say unites all of you on the new right is two things: racism and fascism.
Oh, you forgot hitting women, though.
Misogyny, I guess, creeps in there. It seems like a less of a critique of you, your people.
Incel critique.
The incel, that's right.
Yeah, the incel.
That's right. Your incel, that's right. Incel. So racism, fascism, and involuntary celibacy. Let's talk about those three things. And we've talked about them already a little bit. But those are real, and those are those are real in the movement we're talking about. There are people who are racist and or fascist and or misogynistic in those ways. So and you know, it's called race realism, it's called neo-monarchism, maybe, whatever you want. So tell me, like, are fascism and racism intrinsic to this movement, to this avant-garde?
That's hard to say. I don't want to tell it myself.
The long pause.
Long pause. I would say that racialist thinking is essential. I would say that there are many factions that don't want to admit this, but I would say that we do share commonalities in terms of thinking around racial issues in an objective way. I think that there are hardcore racists. There are people that are very misanthropic who talk about very edgy things, but I think that you can think about these things in a way that the mainstream would code you as a white nationalist. But I think that ethno-nationalist thinking is integral, because if you are willing to admit that racial differences are real, that does not necessarily translate into racial hatred, by the way, I would say. But I would say that if you're dealing with racial issues in an objective level, as we purport, or rather as the dissident right purports, I'm kind of like, not struggle, but I have my own opinion on this issue myself. As an Italian as well, I mean, that's also complicated with what people mean by white nationalism. But I think that the broader coalition, I do think that racial differences are real. Obviously, I mean, that is the premium that you have to have. Racial differences and sexual differences. Those are the two premiums to even think about, not just right-wing thinking, but even the most, I would say, passively conservative thinking. These are ideas that are, again, hung in the aether. You don't have to, like, you could be a Republican, Tucker Carlson, Fox News guy, but you would still admit that racial difference, you maybe not admit it in public, but racial differences certainly are real. That is the premium of, I would say, most contemporary right-wing thinking. Same with sexual differences, but sexual differences, they're easier to sell to people, especially because of the sort of growing, and people that I know is I'm very good friends with Helena, for instance, who was on Tucker Carlson. There's a growing the detransitioner thing is upon us. It is ascendant. So it's it's much easier to critique gender and sexual difference than especially in America, racial difference. It's very hard to still. But I would say that in terms of the humor, in terms of the ironic sort of detachment from the way that most normal people, quote unquote, the normie, thinks about things, I would say that from an outsider's perspective, it seems that we're just a bunch of racists. But I think that, to quote my good friend Orkbrand, who had a tweet that just blew up and went everywhere, it went on Reddit, it went on iFunny. He had this tweet. He says, "It's amazing how tolerant the racist community is. They tolerate you as long as you're just being racist." So, meaning like that, when you admit that racial differences are a real thing, from the outside perspective, that can seem quite racist. And a lot of the humor is very racist. I'm not going to lie. Because racism, as we used to know back in the day before Barack Obama, I hate to say it, everyone knew that racism was funny. Okay.
Yeah.
The old joke was that Dave Chappelle ended racism by making it funny, and Barack Obama had to bring it back for the campaign. That's the joke, but
I love it.
Joke, but it's true. No, I would think that, but there are people who are explicit white nationalists, who are even in term, not even just white nationalists, but I would say that identitarian thinking is more normalized in the political right. Maybe not just white nationalism in terms of like pan-European thought. In America, it's complicated because in America, where people are pretty much more racially mixed in terms of the white phenotype, white nationalism has its birth in America in many ways. But in terms of the European, the sort of the French New Right or the European right wing, they have what they call identitarian thinking. They wouldn't consider themselves, maybe they might consider themselves white nationalists because of the migrant crisis. But in terms of the way that they think of themselves, they are very much ethno-identitarians. They don't consider themselves, like if you're a Hungarian nationalist, you may have the same goals and agreements with an Italian nationalist or with a French nationalist. But you wouldn't say that, oh, I am exactly like an Italian person, or I'm exactly like a French man. So America, in terms of its political ideas and the political right, gets complicated. So this is why racialism is a very, it's a shelling point among right-wing thinking currently. Because even people who are front of face, people who are very optical, quote unquote, they still will admit to certain forms of racialist thinking. Not explicitly racist, mind you, like racism as a production of a hatred and a supremacy, but just the acknowledgement that racial difference is real. That is a premium among right-wing thinking. Definitely.
I need to know why. Why is it that a belief in biologically distinct races of human beings is a requisite for being on the right?
I wouldn't say it's 100% requisite for being on the right.
Okay.
I would say that there are a lot of, for example, religious trads who have problems with it.
Yeah, right.
But I would say that in terms of orthodoxy, it's hard to describe. Okay, it's not that people are explicitly racist. A lot of people are actually, no, I should say a lot of people are. A lot of people are explicitly racist. But I would say that, and here's the thing, this is just for people in the political right hearing this. I don't particularly care. Okay, like in terms of like if you're a racist, like I believe that God has granted every human person with a dignity. But here's the root of why racial difference. Here's the thing. I don't think that just because you believe in racial difference that you're a quote unquote racist to the way that the mainstream media would say you are. I would say that you are easier to entertain certain racialist thinking, but you asked why it's mainstream in terms of right-wing thinking. It's because it grates against the prevailing doctrine of equality and egalitarianism. It is the recognition that there are deeper truths to the human subject that is not obliterated by political ideology, specifically by political liberal ideology, that equality is a false god, that if you go, put it this way, if you go down the primrose path of saying that in thinking around these sort of, let's call it the constructed nature of egalitarianism and egalitarian thinking, then eventually you will lead down the path to thinking through things like race, like biology, like sexuality and gender as having an objective basis rather than a socially constructed basis through mechanisms of power or false consciousness, if you're a Marxist or whatever. I think that even Marxism in its early stages also had some racialist thinking. There are Marxist scholars who go into this.
Sure.
Marxism is not this perfect, egalitarian, progressive thing. At its root, it became that. But I would even say that the Soviet Union even had to interject nationalist thinking. Put it this way. Racial, the reason that you doubt the validity of equality is because hyper-egalitarianism grates with the main basis of nationalist thinking that instantiates the political right. There are people who do very much have, they make their livelihood and their work off of exploring racial differences. Even academics who have been imprisoned. Charles Murray comes to mind, obviously. I tend to not avoid it, but that's not my thing. That's not, but there are people who are formulating ideas from the space of thinking that there is fundamental differences between human beings.
Right.
So that is why, because if you're willing to admit that egalitarianism is a construct and in itself does not have validity in terms of the actual way in which humans socialize and operate with each other between racial and sexual whatever groups, then that thinking becomes much more easily acceptable.
So it's a critique and or reaction to or rejection of universal egalitarianism, which of course has been the hallmark of the left since there's been a left, since Rousseau. That's right. Okay. I guess I just don't know why it has to be about race. I mean, there's so many other differences among human beings that you can point to and identify and celebrate. Why is race of such interest to people? I will tell you, it's disappointing to me because I think, to me, all of the intellectual energy is on the right these days. I mean, I think the left is intellectually bankrupt. I don't think they've had a new idea that's worth anything in decades. All the most interesting and brilliant intellectuals I'm aware of are non-leftists for sure these days. And so, I mean, I think race is what the left says it is. I think it's a bullshit.
I heard those Joe Rogan. You did the Joe Rogan.
Yeah, where I stand on that. So I mean, I think it's bullshit social construct that has done nothing but bad for people. And I'd rather just get past the whole idea. And I'm not going to take you down the whole argument against race. But
no, I know.
But you know where I stand. And you know that position very well. I'm more just curious as to why. And again, I understand the difference between race realism of a Jared Taylor and the racism of the Ku Klux Klan. Right. However, they both at their base have the same set of ideas, which is that there is a hierarchy of biologically distinct races of people, right? That people are divided by biology into races, and that among those races there is a hierarchy. Some are smarter, some are dumber, some are better athletes, some are less good athletes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Both the Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan and Jared Taylor hold that idea from which they do, and all their other ideas emanate from.
Well, I would say the head of the NAACP also holds that idea.
Totally. And let me just say, I also, by the way, I don't give a shit. Okay. I'm not really. I mean, I don't care if Jared Taylor and, 10,000 alt-right guys believe that black people are inferior. It just doesn't matter to me. But I do think it's significant sort of on a broader level, of course, like what we think of race in our society. Right. And here's what I've said to people about the Jared Taylors of the world. He, as kind of I think you just said this in a way, he agrees with 99.9% of the American population on this. The vast majority, almost everybody in this country believes absolutely that there are different races of people and that some are better than others.
Mhm, mhm.
and which is
Yeah,
one reason to call it
yeah.
race realism. But I guess is it because the left went so whole hog about race and made it so central in their ideology, and since World War II have punished severely anyone who would suggest anything like race being real? Is that why you think it's so central? Not in your
No,
thinking,
it's
but in
it's
so
deeper.
much
It's
the right.
deeper. It's deeper.
Okay.
I think that here's what I've been told by people who are more explicitly white nationalist, and this
Okay.
is literature. If you look at like more highbrow sort of resources like Occidental Observer, who've been publishing for since the early 2000s, like they published Jared Taylor. It in some sense the popularity of edgy memes is probably a transgressive thing. But I would say the more intellectual critique would be that race is a basis of one's being to such an integral degree that to purport that race is purely socially constructed. Now, here's the thing. I agree with you in part. I agree that, oh God, I'm getting in so much trouble for this, but like, I agree that certain attributes of one's ethnicity is at least in part socially constructed, but socially constructed, by the way, does not mean not real. Does not mean that we can just turn a switch.
Oh yeah.
Because I think it's true that there's a symbiosis between biology and social construction. But the identitarians, not just the white nationalists, the identitarians would say that because race, or rather maybe race is like not the raw biology, but rather the ethnicity, the ethnos, which is in large part instantiated by race, but it's also instantiated by culture. It's instantiated by geography. It's instantiated by epigenetics of a people. The ethnicity of someone is so integral and important to who they are that to admit that these things are irrelevant is a misnomer. So I can understand the thesis that a lot of the intellectual dark web people have. What they say that the reason that white nationalism, the reason that ethnic, like identitarian thinking, not just white nationalism, is popular is because the left basically, the foundational assumption of the ascendant left-wing ideology from the post-war period onwards, and Thomas 77 says this as well, that anti-fascism, anti-racism is the integral ideology of the American-led modern world.
Yes.
They are partially, yes, you say this as well. They are partially true, but I would say that the identitarians themselves, they would say that the foundational basis of one's being, not just identity, but who one is so bound up in difference and ethnicity and even racial differences that to cast that aside would be an incomplete picture of the human subject. That is what they would say. So yes, I would admit that the edgy memes, the transgression, what people call hipster racism, which was very popular among the alt-right space, I do agree that's a thing. But behind that, if you actually read people like Jared Taylor, if you read the Occidental Observer and like UNZ Report or whatever, and I'm consciously aware of the fact that people have coded these publications as Nazi and racist, whatever. But I'm just saying that if you want to take their word for it, they would say that underneath the transgression is a truth about the human being that cannot be ignored. And no matter how much ideology tries to wash away these differences, like what Jared Taylor says is the best, right? As much as ideology tries to wash away these differences, a white man will still be a European white man. And the black person will be an African American will be an African American. So, but the thing is, African American is also complicated as well, because America, by its nature, because of its history with African Americans, kind of like with Canada in a way, with Anglophone and Indigenous and Francophone, you're going to have to deal with a more complicated racial picture than European identitarians. European identitarians have a much easier time of it. I mean, unless you live in Eastern Europe and Yugoslavia, but as a whole, if you're Hungarian, you're Hungarian. If you're Italian, like you're Italian. If you're German, well, can't talk about German identitarians, but you know what I mean. The point being is that in America, and Jared Taylor and people of this ilk, they recognize that as well, that it's very complicated. That is why pan-European thinking has grabbed hold of America in particular, in North America.
Well, you were talking about white nationalism being born in America. Could it be a result of second and third generation white American immigrants
Yes.
being brought into a white identity, losing their roots with the European homeland,
Yes.
and then seeing Black nationalism being celebrated and seeing Zionism being celebrated?
Yes.
Why can't we have our own thing?
White nationalism in America is older than people think. White nationalism comes from people like Lothrop Stoddard that during the Reconstruction period talked about America's position among the quote unquote races of the world. There's a great essay back in the Thermometer magazine days. You can still find an archive by, he's a friend of mine, but he's quite a contentious figure among the right wing. My friend Carlsbad, he has this essay about Lothrop Stoddard he wrote back in like 2017. But no, their racialist thinking is older in America than people think.
Oh yeah.
And it comes from a number of things like you were alluding to, Michael. It comes from, and here's the thing, I'm no expert in this, right? I wouldn't even I would say that I'm sympathetic to ethno-nationalist thinking. But the whole white identity thing is kind of complicated because you have this large group of new wave European immigrants coming into America. You have not just the Irish people. The Irish people, they're Italians, they're Slavic people, but I would put a cautionary note. I know that it's a very popular narrative in like sort of mainstream academia to say that, oh, well, the white people thing is a construct, and then the Irish people weren't considered white, and so on and so forth. There was a common confluence among people that if you come from European, especially Western European ancestry and Southern European ancestry, because of the Greco-Roman influence on European civilization, that they wouldn't consider you as white as a Saxon or as a Scandinavian or as an Anglo person, but you definitely were a white person. You were someone who comes from a common European ethnogenesis, if you will. So the whole academic obsession was saying that the Irish wasn't considered white, us Italians weren't considered white. I mean, that's kind of a misnomer, in my opinion.
Well, I wrote 4 chapters in this book on that very topic.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think I disagree with you here. So
okay, go ahead. Yeah.
It's tricky. I mean, you have to look at each individual ethnic group, but you have the Italians, your people. There is just abundant evidence that before World War II, they were widely considered among scientists and academics, people who were the experts on this, to be definitely not white. And there was a debate whether they were actual Negroes. Now they were not barred from the vote, right? Civil rights were given to them. Although one could argue, I mean, there were quite a few lynchings of Sicilians in the late 19th century.
There was, yes.
Quite a few. But if you look at the discourse about Italians generally in the 1900s, 1910s, and 1920s, and of course the law in 1924 banned immigration from Italy entirely. That tells you a lot about that. And the argument for that law was explicitly racialist. It was the argument was made in the halls of Congress that Italians and Jews and the rest were biologically different than white people and biologically much more like the anarchic, terrible Black people. That's what they were. And so, yeah, man, I mean, and that was the same was said about Jews, and 100 years prior to that, it was said about the Irish. Okay.
I think in Europe, things were a bit different, but that was a case in America of a hostile political WASP elite that were seeing sort of the demographic problems they had with other European peoples coming to America. And eventually these peoples were assimilated, especially, can we say it? The Jewish people were very much assimilated among WASP society in the 20th century. But I would say that again, America complicates this picture, but in Europe, I mean, there's ethnic conflicts all the time. I mean, the British and the Irish, come on, that's, sure. But in terms of thinking of themselves as part of what you would term European Faustian civilization, in Europe, I think like there's much more of a case to be made that like people like know what a European is and not. But in America, like you said, yes, there was one of the largest I believe one of the largest political racial lynchings was against Italian people.
Yeah.
In
Louisiana.
that one. Yeah. They accused the two Italians of was it rape or theft or something, and they burned down the whole Little Italy, and they lynched people. And
oh yeah,
people don't know about this, by the way.
Quite a few.
But I think like the point is exaggerated though, in terms of academia saying that, white people don't really exist. I think that on the one hand saying white people don't exist, but on the other hand saying that not only do white people exist, but whiteness itself is like, and here's the thing, I know what the academics mean by whiteness. They mean as like a totalizing idea of identity. But the problem is it doesn't, in my opinion, it doesn't matter what the academics mean by whiteness, because the average leftist activist on the ground certainly means whiteness as a racialized category of people that they code as the oppressors. Yeah. So in a sense, academic theory, I know the academic theory around whiteness, so I don't want to mischaracterize academics. I do. Whiteness is a sort of, how do I define it? It's a constructed idea of the predominant identitarian ruling, not just ruling class, but also the majoritarian element within particularly North American society. And from there, you have a number of identitarian critiques and so forth. But I would say that a lot of academics that scream down people, and here's the thing, I don't exactly agree with Jordan Peterson or James Lindsay, but I do think it's disingenuous when academics scream them down, saying that you don't know what whiteness means, when the average activist on the ground, the average journalist on the ground, they think that whiteness is actually white people. So yes. I think that the whole it's a distinction without a difference. In other words, it's kind of like academia with certain issues around gender, and certainly butchering a number of academic theory to instantiate this sort of galvanization of the activist class, and academic theory being propelled by the grassroots of the coalition, the progressive coalition, if you will, that encompasses so many different micro identities. The right wing also has this. The right wing like I've said, has different strains of thinking, different trains of thought, like not just trains of thought, but also different conceptions of identity. But at the same time, I think that there is a difference though, because with the left, it's very much about the avatar of one's identity. With the right wing, it's more about the idea that one holds, the purity of the idea that one holds. People even criticize me for not being sufficiently white nationalist or whatever. I'll give you one last tidbit that I think you'll find very enjoyable. This comes from my friend Catherine D, the amazing writer, default friend. She has this idea about fandom and how fandom is driving modern politics. She made a very good distinction. She says that when it comes to the identity of someone on the political left versus the political right, you have the avatar of a hyper online, let's say Twitter person, the avatar of a anarcho-communist furry, the avatar of a let's say a progressive, what's another popular one? Like some kind of like irony Chapo Trap House leftist that has like the avatar of some trashy 80s, kids cartoon, the embodiment of like a, let's call it the left-wing people that use anime as opposed to the right-wing people that use anime. What Catherine D is saying is that when a left-wing person that comes out of Tumblr culture, comes out of TikTok, when they take on an avatar, that avatar is a foil for what they think is their true self. Right? They become that thing. A lot of the trans issues are guided by this as well. There's certain anime in there. There's certain, furry ideas, whatever. But when it comes to the right wing, though, this is what she says, and I think it's a true distinction. When the right wing takes on an avatar, it is not about who they are as a true self, but rather it is about an ideal. When they have a groiper, that is a political ideal. When they have the helper peppy, the little wholesome, let's call it mentally slow, peppy. When they have a bodybuilder avatar, when they have a picture of themselves because they're a right-wing bodybuilder. It is not about it's not about the perfection of their individual self, like a leftist who has an anime profile. Even a right-wing racist anime avatar is not about what they conceive of themselves as, I am a beautiful anime woman. No, it is about the ideal with the right wing.
Like the Crusader Knight that you see everywhere.
Crusader Knight, yes. Yeah. The Greek bust, even if someone had, and Catherine D says this explicitly, she says, even if someone has a picture of their own body as a right-wing bodybuilder, it is not merely about, this is the glory of my body. It is about the idea of a right-wing bodybuilder, of a Baptist, of a vitalist. So that is the difference. Whereas a leftist, they'll have a furry avatar that has like dressed as Joseph Stalin. They think of themselves as that is their true identity waiting to come out. Whereas a right-wing person will adopt a griper or will adopt a right-wing bodybuilder profile. That is their true ideal. That is the difference. And but that also informs thinking, though, because the contemporary right wing is very much this ideal space. It is not like my idea is a foil for my personal identity. In a way, personal identity is done with. Not totally, but like the group, the fandom becomes the identity. I am a right-wing bodybuilder. I am a white nationalist. I am trad reactionary monarchist with a crusader avatar, and I read like obscure religious tomes from the 15th century. So
this is where they go anti-individualist and anti-libertarian.
Yes,
and a lot of them came from the libertarian space, and a lot of them seem to be ashamed of their past. Or
we've all been there.
Yeah.
So, is that a question though, Michael?
Or just
the libertarian thing,
or the individualist thing. Like they see libertarianism and individualism as like the animating force behind liberalism itself, and that the isolated individual is what's responsible, and that focusing on individual rights is a dead end that leads us to the worst of progressivism.
Well, not only is it a dead end, but like you said, it leads to our own subjugation as well. But I would say that there are people in dissident right who are much more sympathetic to free market ideals, that are much more sympathetic to American conservatism, who don't want to alienate, especially the boomer class, that is very uncomfortable with any critique of So Freudian slip, communism, critique of capitalism, because that is coded as being communist, because Ronald Reagan told them that any critique of American free market capitalism is an evil empire communism. So,
but I think they follow Chicago school economics more so than Austrian economics.
Oh yeah,
correct.
Yeah, because it's practical and evidence based.
Yeah, whereas Austrian economics, it's more of like a theoretical model. There's still libertarians kicking around who are Austrian school people, but I mean, most of us dabble. The Ron Paul days, most of us dabbled in that. I mean, I was pretty big into like Tom Woods and people like that, Mises, but eventually we all grow up, I guess you could say. Eventually we all grow up, but you could see though, but people have written about this. You can see why extreme libertarianism pulls towards extreme authoritarianism. Because if you want to be left alone, how are you going to get left alone? Right?
A lot of guns.
But you have thinkers like Hans Hermann Hoppe, which I mean, Moldbug took inspiration from. You have Robert Heinlein. Not the movie, the actual book, Stormtroop Troopers, where it's like the only way to maintain citizenry in this like more or less free, loving, liberal society is if you have like this crazy, space alien obliterating authoritarian structure over top of it. So Hans Hermann Hoppe is like the genesis of like, remember Richard Spencer? I mean, well, I think he's going back actually to some of his more libertarian liberal ideals, but for a time he was a libertarian blogger, right? Like he was a Hoppian. Although Richard Spencer, I would say, has a very currently funny and interesting idea about pan-Europeanism that includes supporting NATO for some reason. But
Okay.
yeah, yeah. Also banning 4chan. He said that he wants to. He thinks it's a good idea, which I can kind of see. Like he's against populism. The populism question is, of course, very interesting as well. I know Academic Agent recently wrote a book on it called The Populist Delusion, because populism, I think, in the American context was, of course, supported because of Donald Trump, but populism historically has not been a right-wing ideal in any sense of the word.
Correct.
And so like right-wing populism, a la Steve Bannon type of stuff, is complicated when it comes to the political right. Yeah. Populism is a very sticky question. Some people support it. Some people, it's been a disaster. Thinks it's been a disaster. And there's differences among people that think it's a disaster. There's a huge difference between, on the one end, like, reactionaries who think that populism is a disaster, and Richard Spencer, who thinks populism is a disaster for his own reasons. So I feel like I'm rattling away with that.
No. I do want to move on to one of the things I just love about your work and the way you think. Which is that you actually care about how things look and smell and taste and sound. You care about aesthetics.
Yeah.
The reason, one of the first
ironic looking at me, but
no,
I look like shit.
Not at all. Not at all.
Oh boy.
One of the reasons I left the left was, funny enough, that I perceived them to be anti-aesthetic, that they didn't care. It was a purely intellectual movement, right? Purely intellectual culture. It's all in the head. It's all rationalistic. It's, and people literally didn't know what was on TV or what movies there were or who Madonna was when I was, at grad school. And I found it to be suffocating and so limited and just so sterile. And you, I think, have the same frustrations with political people in general. This goes for all political tendencies, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so you're keenly interested, maybe primarily interested in aesthetics. And you have a whole critique of what you call neoliberal aesthetics or neoliberalism, which I find fascinating and very compelling. And I'd like to sort of spend the last part of this interview fleshing that out. So can you talk about what is a neoliberal house or a neoliberal restaurant or a neoliberal song like? I mean, and why do
you have to go to Martha's Vineyard?
Yeah, and like, what do you not like, man? Like, you're reactionary, so you're reacting against something. What do you not like? And I want to hear from a very personal level, like, what do you not like about the culture you see around you?
Wow, I could spend 3 hours of more than that on this. I think that I term it neoliberal kitsch. Yeah. Which I'm formulating a book when I hit my Patreon goal, so maybe people can help me out there. I'm planning a podcast with my I run another sub podcast called Style Talks with my friend Matthew Stout, who is another very great visual artist, and we've been planning an episode for a long time on this. I came up with the term neoliberal kitsch to describe the intersection of what is defined as political kitsch, politically driven kitsch, and sort of like the feel-good, homogenizing aesthetics of the modern world of hypermodernity. A lot of activist art, or rather I should say propaganda masked as art, that is a driving force of what I call neoliberal kitsch. It is in profound aesthetic homogenization that is rooted in the foundational assumptions of liberal modernity. The aesthetics of the modern world that we're seeing now proceeds from the ideological ultra-orthodoxy of the current regime that cannot be questioned. So, for instance, when you have a lot of activist art, a lot of similar themes around things like, certainly the LGBT thing is a very big part of it. The aesthetics that they've driven, the sort of like campy, kitschy, ironically enough, child-friendly, but of course I have theories as to why that is. A lot of BLM aesthetics, a lot of activist art that comes out of various trends in, like, for instance, American cartooning, a lot of trends that come out of, I wouldn't say I would not besmirch the Harlem Renaissance, to say that, but a lot of activist art comes from it. But I do have a great respect for the Harlem Renaissance. I would say the bastardization of various elements of social realism come into play. A lot of the tradition of American kitsch that comes from people like Norman Rockwell, a lot of this like hokey aesthetic, but also I would say what Mark Ogg called the non-place, the sort of mass aesthetic homogenization that comes out of efficiency maxing, comes out of the sort of blandness of non-offensive art. Humans of Flat Designer, a part of this, because the human subject has to be made into the post-historical man.
Ooh.
The human subject has to be instantiated in aesthetics that is no longer coupled to a past, to an aesthetic recognition of difference. It has to be something that is of the end of history. The aesthetics of the end of history is what I call neoliberal kitsch. For example, there are many examples you could find. A great example would be, and this is actually directly, a great example would be using aesthetics as a weapon for the political ruling class. There is this one example where an artist had a picture edit of Kamala Harris, and in her shadow is the Norman Rockwell painting of the little African-American girl. That I believe it is the painting called
Little Rock.
What's it called? All Our Burden that we share.
Oh yeah, but it's about Little Rock, right? Isn't it about?
It's about Little Rock, the desegregation.
Yeah.
Yes. So
Right.
it's about desegregation. It's called The Burden We All Share. I think that's what it's
Right.
called.
Sounds right.
It's the little girl being escorted by the police to the desegregated school. And actually, I mean, if you want to go down the history, like people like Christopher Caldwell talk about how desegregation was like a disaster for a lot of African Americans. But I would say that, think of it this way: Kamala Harris and her shadow is that little girl, African American girl. So the political regime is directly given license and is instantiated by the development of the civil rights movement. But it becomes kitschified because it is coded within this sort of like kitschy Americana, this sort of self-contained unit. And there's people like Kandera, there's people like Robert Hughes, there are critics that define kitsch. I have to brush up a little bit on the exact definition of it, but basically it is provocative sentiment that exists within a self-contained image space that has no reference to history, giving license to contemporary politics. Another example, do you know that famous photo of Iwo Jima, of the soldiers raising up the flag? That guy, he didn't know he like put up his huge camera, he just shot it. He didn't even know he took a picture of this. There is someone that takes that and like puts image edits of like the soldiers. I think there was a painting actually of this where the soldiers are raising the LGBT flag, they're raising the Ukrainian flag, they're raising whatever flag of the month there is, meaning that the sort of mythology, not mythology that it's not real, but I mean that the sort of mythic American narrative of winning World War II against the Nazis. Now that is coded in the language of contemporary politics. If you go to, like, they're not a lot of them around anymore, but if you go to an American veteran and said, "Did you fight for trans rights?" I don't think they would say they fought for trans rights. So, but there is other examples of this. There is sort of the twee aesthetic, the sort of like hipster liberal appropriations of wholesomeness that a lot of the LGBT things involved in. There is many aesthetic templates, but the uniting factor is now the political in terms of like, you know, this, whatever you want to call it, neoliberal modernity. The political has overtaken the aestheticization of life. Now the political is the driving force of the aesthetic. It is no longer the aesthetic that is given free reign since the, you know, let's call it since the Enlightenment period, the 19th century onwards, you know, with autonomous art. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now the political has rechained the aesthetic. But here's the thing: the right wing, though, and this comes from Walter Benjamin, the right wing is should be the aestheticization of politics. It should be viewing politics as another project of the aesthetic of the work of art. But I would say that unfortunately, contemporary right wing aesthetics has also given in to this traditionally progressive impulse to politicize the aesthetic. This is the distinction that Walter Benjamin makes.
Okay.
So I would say that the problem is that a lot of the aesthetics of the modern, of like now the hypermodern world, reflects this ahistorical picture of the self, this total homogeneity that translates into the sort of bland garbage that we see. These people nowadays, they've abandoned the modernists. People talk about how, and there's truth to it though as well. They've abandoned the New York school, modern art, abstract expressionism. They don't care about that anymore. That's not politically useful to them, right? That is a bygone era. If you actually look at the contemporary art world, what do you see now? People have a term for it. They call it new figuration. Where now all of a sudden woke artists, they've discovered figuration again. They discovered the human body. But what does that body reflect? It reflects the ideology of the regime. Now, not all contemporary art does this. I will say that even the most horrendous examples, I find it intellectually curious. I find it, I'm a great respecter of certain contemporary artists. I think that to just hand wave away contemporary art is a mistake. I'm, very controversial opinion on the political right, by the way, very controversial, but I own up to that controversy. But I would say that the operational ideology of the modern world instantiates a return to certain forms of realism and depiction and the human body and so forth. I would say that the sort of intellectual curiosities of things like Art Brut, of modern art as a whole, that left us in the previous century. Of course, the avant-garde was destroyed by, Andy Warhol and things of that nature. Andy Warhol, by the way, I have a thesis that he was an incredible religious reactionary in a lot of his artwork. We could get into that. But I would say that all of that stuff has been abandoned. Now we have this new, sincere neoliberal kitsch, where now the operational ideology of the modern world, now that is wholesome Chungus, kitschy Norman Rockwell aesthetic. That is.
And would you say this is a logical end of the Enlightenment, in that pre-Enlightenment you had art, religion, science all together, philosophy towards one ideal, and when things get specialized and polarized and separated, this is where things end up.
For a time, but now we have a return to that. Now politics, academia, aesthetics, everything is bound together in the sort of totalizing ideology of modern liberalism, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, but the totalizing ideology is a political ideology now. Is that like an idolatry, like a fatal conceit? That's a good word for it, actually. Yeah.
It's a fatal conceit in that the aesthetic has to be in the service of the ideology. But when it comes down to the production of the work of art, there are many factors as to why the work of visual art has suffered in our current digitalized society. But I would say that what we're seeing now is, in a weird way, a return to illustration, a return to the sort of craft arts. Not in a good, what I mean is that the reason that illustration has in some ways toppled fine art is because you can very easily create a pleasing aesthetic picture. You are given license to do so. You don't have the baggage of the art movements of the 20th century, but also illustration can be quite subversive when it comes to politics. I would say that a lot of what people term modern art in the previous century and the 19th century had within it certain anti-modern impulses that were very apparent in painters like Gauguin, to an extent Picasso, especially later work. Even here in Canada with the Group of Seven, even the New York School. Because remember, I mean, Jackson Pollock is like basically a punchline nowadays, especially in my spaces. But what was Jackson Pollock trying to do? He was a Jungian. He went through Jungian therapy. He was trying to give a sort of deeper recognition of various chaotic unconscious forces that have been plaguing humanity from the dawn of time. And he also learned this. If you look at the early Jackson Pollock, he is very enamored by the aesthetics of the Aboriginal tribes, the Six Nations around New York and so forth. So he very much has a, ironically enough, anti-modern impulse, a primordial impulse. But of course, people don't get it. I don't expect people to like Jackson Pollock or, Rothko is a bit more of a cosmopolitan. He had a very much of a neuroticism towards Middle America. American regionalism, of course, fits into this. It's funny because Europe and European art movements, they took a totally different direction. Picasso famously despised the Impressionists besides Cezanne, because Cezanne is the basis of a lot of Cubism, a lot of Italian futurism. But the Impressionists were revived by the New York School in America and by the Group of Seven. A lot of the Group of Seven people, and even before the Group of Seven, one of my favorite painters, William Blair Bruce, actually studied under Monet, went back to Canada, informed a lot of the Group of Seven. And then, of course, you have what they call the Northwestern School, painters like Mark Tobey, that were explicitly mystical, explicitly were exploring like the sort of seeds of the New Age movement. And they informed, in the 1940s, informed the New York School. Now, Jackson Pollock, he was very bad at kayfabing a lot of his influences, but he was directly influenced by Mark Tobey, Morris Graves, those painters around the Seattle, rural Seattle area, and of course the Group of Seven. So, but that's a tangent. That's my own personal thing. Because I live under the shadow of the Group of Seven. No, but I think that when it comes to modernism, what is unrecognized is this anti-modern impulse, this sort of longing to return to the primitive.
Mm-hmm.
Then what happened in postmodernity is that you had the collapsing of those narratives. You had the free play of them. You have Andy Warhol, I would say, creating one of the most lasting critiques of consumerism and consumer capitalism in the art world there has ever been. People think that he endorsed it. He didn't. He was a religious trad. He was a trad cath he was a celibate homosexual that took his mother to mass every single day. And he, in my opinion, I wrote an essay about this many years ago. He created the most lasting critique of modern consumerism that would make any religious trad nowadays blush. But of course, he's coded as this effete decadent, the collapser of what we know as art, the work of art itself. And there is some case to be made of that. I mean, if you're going to expand the space of the gallery, if you're going to create the ready-made, in Europe especially, there was a tradition of that. But I would say that even in America, you have an intensely regionalist impulse. You have the ready-made boxes of what's his name, Cornell? Yeah, Cornell. If you look at his like little sweet, memory boxes, I mean, that's pure Americana. That's, what Duchamp did for Europe, he did for America. Warhol did for America. Even the ready-made is grafted into the identity of America as a whole, into the soil of America. But the reason I bring this up is because when it comes to art and aesthetics and politics, all of these categories are jumbled up in America. America seems to be the sort of abstract machine for the aestheticization of politics and its inverse, the politicization of aesthetics. Because remember, the social realists in America, they were taking a much more older European tradition and they were bringing it to the shores of America. Urshel Gorky brought his influences into the New York School, as well as the Group of Seven. You have all of these different things coming together. But nowadays, in the 21st century, apart from certain aspects of post-internet art and internet art, I can't speak today. Internet art, in terms of certain aspects and certain avenues of the art world, all of this distinction, it ceases. And now art becomes this wholly autonomous thing where the artist itself creates this mythology around their own work. But now you have this reintroduction of a meta-narrative in the work of art, which is what I term neoliberal kitsch, which is the prevailing end of history ideology that comes from the post-Cold War period. Now that is recolonizing the work of art. Now we no longer have postmodern art, we have something else. And it's all in the surface of politics, because now politics, now that for a time, although it's coming back, as we've discussed in a previous webinar, religion was sort of capstoned off, aesthetics went along with it. Now politics becomes the sort of grand meta-narrative of all life. Politics takes the place. Politics fulfills this aesthetic and quasi-mystical longing that people have. I mean, think of it this way. I know it's a terrible example that, is offensive, but do you remember when George Floyd was touring the country as a hologram? Do you remember this?
Vaguely, maybe.
They created a George Floyd hologram.
Oh, yeah.
That toured the country, then toured the world.
Wow.
That's a powerful aesthetic image.
Mm-hmm.
That is a powerful example of using the aesthetic of George Floyd. And there was, endless murals, endless paintings, endless everything created of George Floyd. That is a powerful example of the explicitly racial politics of current day America, colonizing the art space and using the work of art as a form of secularized neo-religiosity. That is neoliberal kitsch in a nutshell.
Amazing. Secularized neo-religiosity. Can you unpack that a little bit? How is it religious in its thinking?
It has certain, here's the difference, okay? Now, Moldbug, I think, popularized this thing. And there's people like Orrin McIntyre that talk about it. That progressivism, modern progressivism, is a religion, or rather it takes the place of a religion. I would think that it's not exactly true in the sense. I would say that there are certain religious impulses among the progressives and progressive ideology. I would say that my friend Daniel Miller, he talked about how it's not so much a religion, it's rather a sort of a animistic mystery cult. It has a lot of animistic impulses. It has a lot of sympathetic magic. The issues around racism and weeding out racism and weeding out sexism, a lot of it has to do with what James Frazier, the great religious scholar, called sympathetic magic. Sorry, there's a car. Oh, no, it stopped. There you go. Anyways, so I wouldn't say it's a religion, because a religion implies redemption. A religion implies a coherent sort of picture of the human subject. But modern ideology also proposes that. I mean, it has the inklings of a religion, but I wouldn't call it a religion, because there is, of course, no redemptive feature to it. There's no transcendence to it. There is if anything, and this is Eric Voegelin's work, a secular form of Gnosticism. There is a sort of false self that I have that is being oppressed by certain forces. Then there is the higher self, the being of light, that I have to get to. And the only way I can get to it is if we instantiate a sort of totalizing millenarian regime, year zero, end of history, you name it. And the only way, if even one racist is breathing in America, I am oppressed because I'm spiritually oppressed. No, there's a lot of so there's a lot of thinking around, not just in right-wing spaces, but I would say that the intellectual dark web people, there's this great essay in Aeon magazine, which is very much not a right-wing publication. It's like a centrist dork web. No, I love the work that they do, but they had this whole like big article about how modern progressivism is a religion. I wouldn't say it's a religion, but it does have a sort of religiosity to it. It has an animism to it. That is why I say it's a secular neo-religiosity. It lacks the metaphysics of religion. It lacks the salvation aspect. The sort of, it has a form of, what would you call it? It has a form of eschatology as well, but the eschatology is never clear, because with modern progressive ideology, the revolution is always happening. It's endless, right? So, but it does have an eschatology too. It has a sort of like post-gender, post-racial thing, right? Like especially the neoliberal order. This is why neoliberal kitsch is so powerful, because it literally figures the human subject into this post-historical, post-racial, post-gender being. That's what my good friend Adam Schiff, my God, sorry, not Adam Schiff. Oh, no way. Eli Schiff. He was a great design critic. He worked in the industry. He was depersoned from the industry. He came up with the term humans of flat design. These largely computer-generated illustrations that every corporation uses, where the human subject is this blobby, misshapen, monocolor, flat thing. It somewhat comes out of Fauvism with Matisse, but really it is the aesthetic picture of the modern subject, the flat, genderless, shapeless blob mass human, the Wall-E human, if you will, that film Wall-E. So this is why I say that there is a Gnostic or neo-religiosity to what is going on behind the scenes, because the way that politics is formed, people say that they used to call it the spectacle, right? Now we call it the current thing. The current thing is the blue and yellow country. The current thing used to be the Covidian era. That in itself is an upsurge of religious sentiment around a cataclysmic event that must be solved, and all of life must be thrown into a state of exception, unless we will be damned. If we didn't flatten the curve, no, it wasn't flatten the curve. If it wasn't zero COVID, we would be damned. If we don't destroy Putler, then we will be damned right now, right? So, and even to the point where the American political class is willing to sacrifice concerns over domestic issues such as supply chain issues. The baby formula thing is an easy meme,
Amazing.
But it's real. Why do you think the Biden administration is willing to, for a number of reasons. There's a huge history behind this current conflict and why America in particular is using this as a proxy war. I know the liberals would absolutely explode at anyone calling it a proxy war. But by all definition, it's a proxy war. Come on.
Of course.
That's, yeah.
Of course.
So the reason why is because they are driven by a very ancient feeling, by the way, an animistic impulse, because the spectacle itself in society, and this is where the aesthetics of modernity come from. This is where politics comes from. The spectacle, like what Debord said, there will be no difference between what we know as the quote unquote real and the spectacle. The spectacle is a totalizing entity. And in some ways, politics in the modern world can only be driven by the spectacle because we've gotten rid of all other forms of difference. Politics is no longer about haggling over our identity. Well, it is in a way haggling over our identity. There's identity politics, but rather the meta politics behind the sort of, order of the current thing. That is driven by the spectacle because we live in this sort of fabulation machine of techno-digital modernity. That is the driving force behind modern politics. The way that, how people say that, Twitter isn't real life, but Twitter becomes real life. Twitter drives modern politics in the West anyways. That Twitter is the digital, what Deleuze would call the abstract machine, channeling different affects, channeling different impulses of feeling and sentiment and different economic flows and hesieties. Hesieties, for those who don't know, it means the capacity by which things are different from one another, right? Largely. Twitter is like the political and cultural abstract machine. Wherever Twitter goes, public policy and culture is not far behind. We know this, right? And so, because that is the template by which we solve politics and culture in the modern world. And aesthetics is not far behind. The aesthetics of things, the image itself now becomes the primary vector of not just political ideology, but cultural output as a whole.
Right.
Politics is driven by the image is driven by politics. George Floyd touring the country, the Black Power fist, the fucking what is it? The Handmaid's Tale.
Oh yeah.
The Handmaid's Tale. That is another one. The sort of all under his eye, the bonnet. By the way, there is porn being made of that particular ensemble. I've been told.
Sure.
Yeah, so there's some kind of weird Oedipalization of power there, but so there is a symbiotic relationship between the image, the dialectical image, as Walter Benjamin would call it, and the political, and the digital, and the cultural.
Okay.
All of these things come together, and they instantiate a sort of supplicant for these very deep and primal feelings of religiosity and mysticism, if you will.
Okay, so right, so for the neoliberal,
that's terrible.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I just realized what a theory cell I am. That was a terrible.
No. Let me
Very
try
sorry.
Let me see if I got it. So the ruling class, the neoliberal ruling class of the last century or so, has attempted to remove individuals from their histories, meaning their individual identities, right, and all that went into them, right, their community, where they're from, the geography, ethnicity, the particular culture they grew up in, their families, in order, am I right, to more easily manage them. We're talking about the emergence of a vast managerial ruling class, right? This is from Foucault as well. So according to Foucault, in the pre-modern era, they just cut off your head if you acted up. Now they've gotten
sovereign power,
much more intelligent. Governments and corporations, they're interested in managing us, right? Yes. And so to separate us from all that makes us individual and different, right, is essential, or at least it helps them in managing us. And we all become the same instruments or objects to manipulate around.
I would, go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I would say that it's not a one-to-one relationship. I mean, I think there is a place for conspiracy thinking. I think that it's obvious that there is at least a level of coordination. But if you're getting into Michel Foucault, there is no such thing as a conspiracy. There is a operationalization of discourses that have developed historically over time.
Right.
And so when it comes to what you would say, how does the aesthetic relate to modern power? I would say that initially a lot of it was part of the development of art and aesthetics up into the 21st century. I would say that certainly when it comes to the LGBT camp aesthetic, there is an organic, at least initially an organic development of that. I know that a lot of gay men in particular have a very keen aesthetic sensibility, but they have, unfortunately, the gay man, and me and Jack, the previous national, we could talk about this. The gay man has been toppled. Now the trans aesthetic is uniquely different from the gay camp aesthetic. In some ways, it's even more gratuitous, if you will. But I would say that these things develop organically, because here's the tidbit. Here's the thing. This is proving Foucault's point. And what I wanted to say is that having at least in part defended Michel Foucault to the political right, there's no way that you could create a right-wing Michel Foucault. I mean, you can create ideas that are very useful, but there's a number of assumptions that Foucault has, from his individual anarchism to other things that are quite problematic when it comes to, I know the word problematic, but problematic when it comes to a right-wing interpretation of Foucault. But I would say that there has been a number of scholarship that has been done. My good friend Jeffrey Schollenberger, my good friend Daniel Miller, other people have postulated that there is fertile roots there when it comes to certain Foucauldian ideals.
Oh yeah.
Biopower, especially power knowledge. But power knowledge is key here, because power knowledge comes about from the development of these discourses. Power knowledge states that because knowledge and because power operates upon what Foucault called the lesions of the human body, the sort of machinations of the development of our picture of the human subject. And because knowledge from the Enlightenment onwards the way that we think and interpret knowledge is so important and critical to the development of the self.
Mm-hmm.
Because power informs our capacity for knowledge generation, the way we quantify and qualify it, power creates the human self, the subject.
Right.
Now, I would say that in terms of the modern subject, this is true, but I would say that when it comes to the right wing is a purely essentialist view of the human subject. And so there can never be a true right-wing Foucault. I mean, that's true. But even saying what is true or not is kind of like subject to power knowledge, right? The reason, so you asked me about how this developed. I'll give you a good tidbit here. Again, to bring up my friend Catherine D. Because she was immersed in this Tumblr culture stuff. You know, I was, as you can tell, I was more of a 4chan guy back in the day. But I was just a lurker, whatever. I would say that when you look at like the SJW quote unquote ideology, when you look at like the transgender stuff, when you look at the racial politics to a lesser degree, because racial politics in America is a much older tradition. But when you look at like the sort of the weirdo normalization of things, all of like the mainstream like dark web critics of it, like James Lindsay, they get it wrong. They get the genealogy wrong. Here's how they get it wrong. It did not come from a conscious effort of academia. Now, there are academics in queer theory in particular, like Pat Califia, like even Judith Butler, who have very, very hair-raising ideas when it comes to children in particular. But you have to look at it this way. These academic theories, it's not that they merely percolated over time from the ivory tower down to the activist base. It was rather the hyper online fandoms of places like Tumblr that took academic theory and elevated it to the mainstream. And the reason they did this is Catherine D's theory, is because journalists during the 2010s were so supremely bored and uncreative because of Obama, because of the ruling political apparatus being, you know, when Trump said, we're going to win, we're going to keep winning, and you're going to be so sick of winning, we're going to win some more. Well, what was Obama during his second term in terms of culture war issues? He won. They were so sick and they won some more. The gay marriage thing, the Trayvon Martin thing, you name it, right? So here's what happened. Journalists, they would pick the fertile soil of places like Tumblr, places like LiveJournal, places like Something Awful and Reddit that will later on Reddit. And they said, oh, it's kind of interesting. These little kids, they're into this like critical theory stuff. I wonder what we can make of this. I wonder what hay we can make of this. Then you have the lower level blogs like, you know, Vice Magazine, Jezebel, Daily Dot. Eventually, you have the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Daily Beast writing about MB kids, transgender, whatever's, you know, like Tony Soprano. I guess in your line of work, you deal with, you know, gays, trans, whatever's, right? So what happened was a lot of the 2010s sexual and racial politics, it wasn't merely a conscious effort by whatever, like James Lindsay or Jordan Peterson says, like cultural Marxists or whatever. Right. It was rather these largely young people taking these academic theories that they heard of secondhand from the internet. They didn't actually read the texts, God forbid. Maybe some of them read Monoscoop. They read a PDF or two on Monoscoop. But by and large, it was Tumblr blogs using theory. And then that theory, because of fucking bored and lazy journalists, took that and said, whoa, those young people are creating a hip new identity movement. And then all of a sudden it goes from Motherboard, which is Vice Magazine, it goes to the Daily Beast, and from the Daily Beast, it goes into New York Times, the letters of record. Letters, yeah. So the genealogy is not this like perfect picture that people like James Lindsay think it is, that these neo-Marxist academics, they somehow made some Jedi mind tricks where they like took these young kids and they put them in the progressive religion madrasas.
Mhm.
I mean, there was some of that as well. I'm not totally discrediting it. He does. I mean, as much as I bash James Lindsay, he does do some of the good work with the groomer thing. But like, no, there's a more nuanced picture as to how these like in the span of 10 years from Obama onwards, how we went from like these weirdo Tumblr blogs to now talking about having clinics in New York City. That one guy, I'm misgendering. That one trans person doctor saying they've done 2,000 mastectomies on teen girls. How do we get from that to that in the span of 10 years?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it was a totally conscious effort, by the way. I mean, there was certainly some of it behind the scenes, but I think that there's a more nuanced picture as to how these things come to prominence than just being a guiding hand.
It was
Sorry, I cut you off, Mike.
No, it was a genuine cultural movement. It wasn't coordinated from on high. We may hate it, but it was a real cultural movement that rose organically.
Yeah, and it could have been
I did my undergrad during those years, 2014, 15, 16.
Same, yeah.
And,
same.
Wow. And you could see it in real life. And Thad, you were teaching back then. When this whole wave hit colleges, professors didn't know what to do with it. They were terrified of their own students.
Correct.
And you either had two kids who one of them just rolled over and let them run them over and create this new ideology. And I think now we're getting the first generation of grad students to come from there. And but it wasn't from the top down. It wasn't the professors indoctrinating the kids. It was
exactly right.
Yeah. Thad, you know how you said, let me ask you, you said that when you were in grad school, nobody knew about who
Madonna was.
Or nobody is watching Melrose. Oh, I'm totally dating you.
As Melrose Place.
Melrose Place.
That's right.
News Radio.
Yep.
What else is? Oh, I mean, Duckman.
Seinfeld.
You know, Seinfeld. Yeah.
Sure.
I wanted to avoid Seinfeld because everyone knows Seinfeld. You know how you said like when you were in academia, where you were in grad school, that nobody. Here's the thing: during the 2010s, this totally changed. Now pop culture, and this is again part of the neoliberal kitsch thing. Pop culture. Go ahead, Michael. Go ahead.
I just want to get. I really wanted to get into this and your thoughts on Adorno. So I'm excited.
Oh, okay.
I wrote whole papers on Adorno. A big part of my the essay that made me famous actually was taking Adorno. I think that Adorno, again, another problematic thinker from the political right. I mean, his work on the authoritarian personality, I think is bullshit. But I think that when it comes to the dialectic of enlightenment and when it comes to his negative dialectics, when it comes to his book Aesthetic Theory, I mean, he almost sounds like a reactionary in some regards.
Oh, yes, he is.
Yeah, very much so. And I think like when people criticize Jordan Peterson, they're correct 100% that like he's talking about like culture, like the Frankfurt School, but like maybe like certain elements of Marcuse, obviously. Sure. Although One Dimensional Man, I think, is vital for every right-wing thinker to read.
Really?
Yeah. One Dimensional Man. But when it comes to Eros and Civilization, very much like anarchic sexuality, free love crap that is like very problematic. But when it comes to Adorno, what I wanted to say is that pop culture during this time in academia was on the ascendancy. Because Adorno was right, and this comes from Adorno, like Michael was saying, the collapse between higher and lower culture. Now you have grad students doing their dissertations on the Beyonce-fication of American culture. I've read some. A lot of it's bullshit. Some of it's quite good, actually, but a lot of it's bullshit. So now cultural studies becomes ascendant because mainstream culture is a main vector.
Yeah, but this goes to your point. Though. So back in the 90s when I was in grad school, they weren't interested in pop culture because then pop culture was not political.
Right. Well, it kind of was. But like,
I mean, they wasn't made political yet. It wasn't made political.
Right.
Beyonce and company, pop culture has been made political. And now that it's been made political, you can study it. But again, this is your point. you can only study it as a political thing. You can't study it as an aesthetic thing. And you certainly can't celebrate or even appreciate the aesthetics of any pop culture form now. It can only be appreciated for its politics, and it's usually critiqued for its politics, right?
Yeah.
That's what you're getting
Robert
at.
Reich, The Simpsons is a great example.
Yeah.
Development. I mean, Robert Reich doing a lecture on. Recently,
So let's make this the last question. Now we're passing 2 hours here. So Adorno, I fucking hate Adorno.
Why do you hate Adorno?
Well, I mean, many reasons, but his critique of pop culture is the worst thing, I think. And this is where
you went too far. Yeah, you did.
No, it's just where you and I differ, and it's just purely on values. I'm just curious about your values about this. So, Adorno wrote about jazz being terrible and Hollywood movies being terrible for various reasons, the massification of the American mind. I don't know if he used the word decadence, but I know you have used that word. But what's the problem with jazz, man, and rock and roll and Hollywood for you, Gio? Like, when you do art, what are you trying to do?
I love jazz, actually.
Yeah. So, but Adorno hated it, right? Why?
I know, but you can't be a slave to any one particular thing.
What's like when you see pop culture, but for pop culture now or anytime, like, what's your problem with it?
It's trash. No, I think Adorno, in the one sense, I think he didn't see the sophistication in jazz, but I do agree that he saw those things as symbols of the massification of culture, the commodification of culture, and how the culture industry ultimately uses repetition as a way of breaking down barriers to its own ends, and uses it in such a way as to instantiate the mass homogenization of all life.
Okay.
And he said it's because of economic reasons. I think that I look beyond his Marxism to say that it's not just economic reasons. It's very specifically cultural and, in my opinion, even spiritual reasons why the mass homogenization of culture has developed into how it's developed. But when I look at contemporary pop culture, I think that the pop culture of the previous few decades at least had enough meat to be interesting. But nowadays, I think that because by definition, everything has to be cut and dry and clear, and there can be no ambiguity. I'll give you a good example. And this is, if we were to say that memes are pop culture nowadays, which I think I have problems with, but you know how the phrase of the left can't meme? You know that phrase, right? Why is left can't meme? Why?
No sense of humor.
No, but why don't they have a sense of humor?
Because they think they are Jesus figures. They're martyrs.
Yes,
something like that. Okay.
My opinion. I wanted to write something, actually. People have begged me to write about something like this. The reason the left can't meme is for a number of reasons, because one of the main ones is that when you are crafting a sensibility around contemporary politics, there can be no ambiguity. There can be no mixing of messages. The reason the right wing is so effective at memes, one is just like the base, like lizard brain, like racism and sexism is inherently funny. And like, come on, if you're going to pretend it's like, even Jack says this, if you're going to pretend it's not, then I'm sorry, you're fucking lost. Like there's something wrong with you, or you're just being purposefully idiotic because of politics, right? Let's face it, racism and sexism, super funny. I don't care what anyone says, it's true.
Sure.
But also, the reason the right wing is so effective is, in some ways, it goes back to Leo Strauss, with the persecution thesis, where when you can't openly be sexist and racist and other things and homophobic or transphobic, you have to create a memeplex that can convey various wrongthink, but also evade censorship and use like innuendo and like point to things and do a very simple breakdown in a very few short bursts of information to be truly subversive. Right? Like, but you can also grow various sophisticated meme templates. I'll give you a good example. There was this poster, Wyhan's on. on Twitter. He got banned ages ago. He pretended, I don't know if he actually was Chinese, but he pretended to be a Chinese exchange student, and he would say like the most ridiculous, like racist, like just, he would say it in like broken English. But his big thing was whenever he would like post pictures, like, or whenever he would see a mixed race couple on Twitter, he would post broken branch, ancestor cry. Broken branch meaning that your genetic line has been snapped like a branch. And so then if you go to Twitter nowadays and you type in broken branch, everyone knows the immediate like right-wing meme humor connotation to broken branch. A simple phrase, broken branch, has this whole like trollish, racist type of apparatus to it.
Whoa.
That is why it's effective, because when you are operating in a hostile environment, you have to be very witty, very snappy, but you can't say too much. Whereas the left, because they cannot have any ambiguity to their messaging, because it could potentially do the opposite. No, for example, there's this one account on Twitter. There's a number of accounts like this where it's something along the lines of like leftist memes that are actually based. So they'll have like propaganda about like, for example, Ben Garrison cartoons of like, you know, Trump is like this Giga Chad, or like what would be another example? Basically trying to like say that the right wing are these evil strongmen fascists, but then it's like, wow, that actually makes us look good. So it's sort of like what Foucault would call detourment or a counter discourse, where the Giga Chad's the perfect example of this.
Yeah, or the Chad saying yes to everything.
The gamer had yes. Yeah. That is a counter discourse. When they say that you are this, you are that, you post a Giga Chad and you say yes. It's the affirmative. It's a detourment. So that is a very like, you know, highfalutin French critical theory concept that can be easily applied to the political right, meme culture. Like this is what you know, again, this is what Angela Nagel called the right Gramscians. Through this like subversive troll culture,
right,
is this whole like pretext of cultural politics that the right wing has created. That's very subversive. But of course, like, I mean, it's not perfect because memes can become stale and they can become, for example, like Fashwave became a parody of itself, where like leftists, like especially like people that listen to Chapo Trap House, what we call the ironists, right? They would take like Fashwave and they'd be like, instead of like, you know, return to tradition, they would post like, I don't have a girlfriend, therefore the modern world must collapse or whatever.
Right.
Like it became easy to spoof because in some ways Fashwave was almost too sincere. So the sincerity made it very easy to parody from a left-wing perspective, because it's like, why do you want to return to tradition? Because I don't have a girlfriend. That feel one no GF, right? Like that. And that opens up another discussion. But I think like pop culture became ascendant for a very specific reason. Because if you truly want to know the ideology and the way things are going, you don't have to look at like, you know, whatever some like Antifa account on Twitter tweets. Look at a show like, look at medical dramas. Look at Law and Order SVU.
Yes.
You want to know the ideological picture of like the way that things are going?
Yes. Totally.
Look at Law and Order. Look at the Mariska Hargitay show. You know, like that is very subversive, because who watches it? Liberal, younger to middle-aged white women.
Yep.
Who has, you could argue, the most cultural and political power?
Yes. Totally.
Younger to middle-aged white women.
They run the country. Absolutely.
White women run the country.
Absolutely. Very persuasive. My friend, this has been a tour de force again.
Oh, another. Yeah.
My gosh, you have a lot to say. It's incredible.
If someone's asking good questions, I have a lot to say.
I'm actually lamenting it because there's so much more that we didn't get to that I wanted to ask you. I know Michael had some questions we didn't get to, but we're going to do more with you in the future. So expect those futures sometime later. But thank you for doing this. This has been amazing.
Yeah. Maybe we could have an explicit, like we were saying, Foucault thing in the future.
We should.
You brought up Schellenberger. I don't want to start another tangent, but Schellenberger found the parallels between Girard and Foucault, and I think you're one of other thinkers who could find that too.
I think we could get.
He's a good friend of mine. I did his Outsider podcast.
Yeah, Jeff's a friend of mine too. We could get Jeff and Jack, the Perfume Nationals, and Gio on some panel or something. That'd be incredible.
Oh, well,
right?
Mega panel.
Mega panel,
mega
right
powers. Yeah, there you go.
Incredible.
Mega powers.
All right, my friend and my friends, Michael, Gio, thank you so much. We will be in touch.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
This is the Unregistered Podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. To become a patron of the show and have access to bonus episodes, AMAs, and the Unreported News Analysis Show, go to patreon.com/unregistered. Thanks for listening.